In my library here at home, I have 2 shelves that are devoted to books on ruby and sapphire. I have about 15 or 20 shelves of books on jade. It is such a bigger subject area because it's not just a gemstone. For all the cultures where jade was found, it was always considered the most valuable material. In China, in athletic competitions, the winner does not get a gold medal. They get a jade medal. Jade was always reserved for first place. When, I think it was Cortez, went to the New World and conquered the Aztec capital, which is now Mexico City, supposedly Montezuma said to his people, "Thank God they don't care about the jade."
We always say that the 2 gemstones called jade are Nephrite jade and Jadeite jade. But there is a glaring problem with this. A major question that's been circulating around the jade trade is this: is Jadeite jade a defunct term? Enter Fei Cui, the word used in China and Hong Kong for what the US calls Jadeite jade. With the help of jade legend Richard Hughes and published gemologist Kaylan Khourie, both from renowned gem lab Lotus Gemology, we're going to be answering the jade industry's most pressing questions about what Jadeite jade actually is, what Omphacite jade is, and what makes a gemstone jade. This video is for members of the jewelry trade, jade collectors and aficionados, and honestly, anyone who's seeking a gemological report for their jade stone. Richard Hughes is an award-winning gemologist and author, owner of Lotus Gemology in Bangkok, Thailand, and was the editor of the 2022 book that rocked, get it, the jade industry, Jade, a Gemologist's Guide. And Kaylan Khourie recently published an exceptional article in the Journal of the Gemological Association of Hong Kong titled The Hardness of Fei Cui Jade, a Gemological Perspective. I cannot stress enough how badly everyone in the jewelry trade needs to read this article. That means you. Keep watching to find out at this critical time in gemology, has the definition of jade changed? And what does this mean for the industry, and more importantly, the customer, moving forward?
On our report, we have a very simple statement that is, Fei Cui is the traditional Chinese term for a pyroxene jade. It may be a combination of jadeite, omphacite, and kosmochlor. You can consider Fei Cui to be a synonym of pyroxene jade. It is a more accurate term than calling something jadeite. It's scientifically and mineralogically more accurate. In the mineralogical and geologic world, they don't call this rock jadeite. They call it jadeite or
Omphacite,
which I can never pronounce, or
kosmochlorite.
What is jade? Jade is, as Rodney Cook eloquently put it in our collaborative video on Cat's Eye Jade, a sophisticated trade term. Gemologically, in the US, jade refers to the amphibole known as nephrite jade, and the pyroxene jade, Fei Cui, known in the US as jadeite jade, which is not necessarily comprised of jadeite. Jadeite, a different term from jadeite jade, is not a gemstone. It's a single crystal that can be in jade. We'll explain all that later in the video. Nephrite jade has a long history in China, going back thousands of years.
The term that they use for jade in China is yu, and that's what we in the West call nephrite. When the Fei Cui started to come into the Chinese market in quantity during the 17 and 1800s in the Qing dynasty, they knew that the material was different. They used an old term that had been applied to a bright green nephrite, Fei Cui, and they applied that to the new material. The term Fei Cui had been used for that material long before Damour first got his hands on jade. Fei Cui was a jade-like material, and the Chinese had various criteria of what constituted jade. The material that came into the market from Myanmar had the properties that they considered it jade, but they immediately knew it was different. And of course, anybody who put a piece on a lapidary wheel would know that it was different. Traditionally in China, they had 4 different materials that they called jade, the so-called 4 great jades, which is described in our book. Nowadays, because of what Damour did, nowadays there's only 2 of those that are considered to be quote-unquote true jades. Where the problem came in was that Damour was working with the tools of the day, and so he knew that the material we call Fei Cui was different from the Hertian Yu, the nephrite, and so he coined a new term for them. He coined the term nephrite, which was in general use for that particular type of stone, lapis nephriticus, stone of the loins or stone of the kidneys. So he coined a new term, which he called jadeite. But our latest research shows that within a year or 2 of his article, he definitely knew that in China the stone was called Fei Cui. In any event, he coined the term jadeite, and that's the name that stuck. What he didn't understand was that it was actually an aggregate of different minerals. Now we fast forward to the early years in the 20th century, the 1910, 1920, 1930. Mineralogists and geologists knew that this was an aggregate of minerals, but that knowledge never made its way into the gemological world, which is what created the problem that we have today.
Before we get too deep into this, I want to make sure that everyone knows that there is a more technical explanation of Fei Cui already on YouTube called Jadeite Jade or Fei Cui with Dr. Edward Liu. So I'm including a link to his video below. Moving forward with this video, we'll be discussing Fei Cui or Jadeite Jade, not Nephrite Jade. But don't worry, we have a whole playlist on Nephrite, so be sure to check that out on your way down the rabbit hole. A 2012 article from industry leader, the Gemological Institute of America, came out titled The Jadeite Omphacite Nomenclature Question. What happened after that was a domino effect of papers and videos and gemological discussions trying to answer that question. Not just at a laboratory level, but within the trade. GIA has their own perspective, and as laboratories came out with different data, we started to see disagreement in the international industry about how to identify omphacite-rich jade on gemological reports.
The instruments that most gem labs use only test a small area of the material. So if that area that they happen to test is mainly composed of jadeite or omphacite kosmochlor, then that's the spectrum that they're going to get. And that's the general identification that they're going to assign to the material. But there's a lot of factors involved when testing a mineral aggregate compared to testing a single crystal gemstone like ruby, sapphire, emerald, where you can generally trust the spot reading, so to speak, that you take anywhere on the stone, barring any significant zoning. But with a mineral aggregate, basically a rock like Fei Cui, you can't treat it in the same way. If you really want to be certain about what the composition of the material is, you have to analyze everything in it, every single grain. Now, there's ways to analyze the surface of the material with spectroscopy, doing mapping across the stone, and that still has its own limitations, but that doesn't mean the center of the stone is going to be the same as the surface of the stone. So you'd have to destroy the sample, powder it, and analyze that powder, which obviously defeats the purpose of having the material. When you running a spectrum, a Raman spectrum or something like that on a stone, the laser size might be too large, might overcome more than one mineral grain. So you're going to get the dominant signal from that area that you're measuring. So if there's 50% of those minerals that you're analyzing are omphacite and 50% of them are jadeite, you're going to get a spectrum that's intermediate between jadeite and omphacite. Also keeping in mind that each mineral grain can be a solid solution between jadeite, omphacite, and kosmochlor because they're related members. So you can have an individual grain that's theoretically 50% jadeite and 50% omphacite. So it's very complicated to try and quantitatively test Fei Cui. It's better to qualitatively test it and prove that one of the Fei Cui minerals, so to speak, at least one of them is present in the material, and that's significant enough to call it Fei Cui. But trying to quantify the exact amounts, it's irrelevant, and it's not practically possible without destroying the sample.
When you're building a definition, you try to build something that is scientifically accurate, number one. Calling a specimen that is a rock jadeite is not scientifically accurate. As Edward Liu pointed out in his YouTube video, which I urge everyone to watch, a piece of marble is not the same as calcite. Calcite's a mineral, marble is a rock. The same way in the gem world, lazurite is a mineral, but lapis lazuli is the rock. They're not the same. You can't treat them the same. It's actually scientifically incorrect to take something like a Fei Cui gem and call it jadeite, because you can't really determine that. It's not a single crystal and it's not an end member. It's a rock.
Minerals jadeite, omphacite, and kosmochlor are pyroxenes that form a solid solution series. So not only do they exist in the same rock, but a single crystal might not be strictly jadeite or strictly omphacite, but something in between. We used to think that to be Fei Cui or jadeite jade, a gemstone had to exist in this little corner, comprised primarily of tiny crystals of jadeite that compacted together during formation. Consequently, we believed that omphacite jade was a different gemstone, comprised solely or primarily of the mineral omphacite. Some people even went as far as to say omphacite wasn't jade. So a gem lab might test 3 or 4 teeny-tiny spots on the surface of a gemstone, and they'll determine based on that test what they think the primary composition of that stone is. The findings based on that test might determine the difference between a jadeite jade report and an omphacite jade report. As an industry, we thought that if a stone has primarily omphacite in it, that it will show up on that test, and that it should be disclosed as omphacite jade to the customer. But what if that's wrong?
The question is, how many spots are enough? And as Edward Liu has pointed out very clearly,
Right.
even if you map the entire surface using a Raman spectroscopy, it's still not enough.
The deeper you dive into the material, the more you understand how complex the intermixture is between the materials, down to several microns. There's complex intermixing of the material. You can have thousands of different grains within there that could all be different. The material hasn't changed. It's the naming of it that has changed. As technology evolves and our knowledge of gems evolves, so must the nomenclature of the material. It's completely irrelevant whether it's test as dominant omphacite or test as dominant jadeite, because you're always going to be limited by the testing methods, just like the Moor was limited in when he was separating nephrite and what's called jadeite.
Many sellers claim to be selling omphacite, and they're not being misleading at all. Not intentionally, anyways. For the most part, the industry has been operating this way for quite a few years now, and it's not well known that determining the primary mineral in a stone is impossible without destroying the specimen. But what do we know about omphacite? And are there any indicators that a jade stone might be primarily comprised of it?
Well, it really depends. Omphacite is largely colored by iron and chromium based on our current understanding. It can range from a very dark green, almost black, to a very bright green, depending on the trace elements in it that would be giving its color. That's our current understanding as it is now. They may find omphacite colored by other trace elements of different colors in the future.
Don't quote me on this necessarily, but my understanding is that omphacite is idiochromatic and that the iron is a basic part of its composition, and the iron creates the color. So you're not going to have a colorless omphacite. It's going to be varying shades of green depending on how much it's diluted, in the case of Fei Cui, by the other minerals that are present. Kosmochlor, I believe, is the chromium pyroxene.
Yeah.
And so I'm guessing here, I'm going out on a limb a little bit, but I'm guessing that if you didn't have any kosmochlor in the stone would not be green. And it's the mixture of the three that creates the various colors that you see. And there are secondary colors like the brown and reddish and yellow jades that come from the skin of boulders. Those are mechanically colored by natural staining. But when we're talking about the material that doesn't have that kind of staining, jadeite is allochromatic. It can be many different colors, but if it's pure, It's colorless. And a few years ago, they found some pieces of single crystal jadeite. You will see this most often in lavender jade, where the crystals tend to be far more coarse. You can see the individual crystals sometimes with the naked eye. In fact, we have a photograph of one of those in our book where you can clearly see the individual grains. So if the grain is colorless, well, then you know that that's jadeite, because it's allochromatic, it's colored by impurities. If you have kosmochlor or omphacite, those are self-colored in the same way that asbesartine garnet is self-colored. It's colored by manganese, which is part of its chemical composition. Turquoise is self-colored. It's colored by copper. Take away the copper in turquoise, it's no longer turquoise. If you take away the chromium from kosmochlor, it's no longer kosmochlor. If you took the iron out of omphacite, it would no longer be omphacite.
Although jadeite is allochromatic, that doesn't mean that if you see a green grain, that's automatically kosmochlor, because you do get jadeite that contains chromium and in trace elements enough to give it a green color, but not enough to consider it kosmochlor.
The term Fei Cui is used as an umbrella term in China and Hong Kong. You will see in books, for example, Mimi Ouyang, who is like the godmother of jade science. She's an extremely important figure. In one of her books, which is called Fei Cui, A Stone and a Culture, she clearly talks about black Fei Cui, green Fei Cui of various types, red Fei Cui, yellow Fei Cui. It's all Fei Cui. We do have this chart that was in Kaylan's article. There have been some people who have misinterpreted the chart as, look, you can identify omphacite, you can identify kosmochlor. And so we've adjusted the caption so that it makes it clear that no, we can't. These are stones that test as omphacite, test as jadeite, test as kosmochlor. But the reality is we cannot quantitatively determine their exact composition.
If you've learned something you didn't know before, please smash that like button and subscribe. But more importantly, leave me a comment and let me know if this is the type of information you want to see on this channel. Do you like the technical, in-depth explanation? If you do, I must implore you to watch my video collaboration with Washington Jade on Cat's Eye Jade, where we pose the question, is Cat's Eye Nephrite real jade? Also, don't forget to cue Edward Liu's video. And if you work in the jade trade or really want to learn as much accurate information as you can on the subject, strongly consider buying Lotus Gemology's book, Jade, a Gemologist's Guide. This nomenclature problem, where the amount of jadeite, omphacite, and kosmochlor can't be determined in a jade specimen without destroying it, changes things for the trade. But what the trade and the customer need to understand, above all else about this matter, is that the stone has not changed. Jade has not changed. Our understanding of the stone has changed. And that calls for an adjustment in nomenclature. Not a change, because the word Fei Cui is already being used for jadeite jade in most of the jade industry. It just hasn't really reached the US yet.
Because Fei Cui has, and nephrite have interlocking structures, it makes them very, very tough. And that's why they're good for carving. You can carve away at a piece and it's not going to just fracture through the entire material, because the interlocking structure keeps it stable, so to speak. And the granular nature, maybe you fracture one grain, because it's not directly connected to the next grain, that's where the fracture stops. So you can break off essentially small grains at a time and carve the material, and it's very, very tough.
It's very, very tough, but for any gemstone, you need to take care of it. Obviously, regarding the hardness, because both Fei Cui and nephrite are less than 7 in hardness, the hardest component of the dust in the air is quartz. And so any gem that is softer than quartz, if you wipe the dust off of it enough times, you'll put micro scratches on it. It'll eventually lose its polish. But that's true for any gemstone that's softer than quartz, including some very expensive gems like opal and tanzanite, and there are many, many others. You should take good care of your jewelry of all types. Don't consider it to be indestructible. But in terms of hardness and toughness, it's a wonderful gem material.
So the difference between gemology and mineralogy, mineralogy is purely scientific. It's there to analyze the material and classify it based on strict mineralogical definitions. The International Mineralogical Association is the ruling body that makes the final decisions on what is considered what, and generally the mineralogical community accepts these. In gemology, there's two factors. It's the scientific factor, but there's also the commercial factor. And ultimately, gemology has to also answer to commercial interest. In mineralogy, ruby and sapphire are not accepted terms. Those are varietal names. Varietal names are not accepted. So in mineralogy, red corundum it's corundum. But in gemology, we call that ruby because there's commercial importance over whether something is a ruby or a sapphire. So just like with Fei Cui, or with jade, calling something, even if it is completely, you somehow determine it was completely omphacite or completely jadeite, it's not really scientifically defensible to call it that without destroying the sample, but it's not relevant to the client. The client needs to know that, yes, this is pyroxene jade. It's the same material that's been called jadeite for hundreds of years, but Fei Cui is the almost varietal name of that rock, just like lapis lazuli is the varietal name of a rock containing lazurite, calcite, and pyrite. There's definitely a difference between gemology and gemological definitions and mineralogy and mineralogical definitions.
I am a seller, I am a content creator, but I am not a jade expert yet. I am deeply grateful for true experts like Richard Hughes and Kaylan Khourie, as well as the many other jade professionals who have come on my channel, including Kirk Makepeace, Jeff Mason, Andrew Shaw, Rodney Cook, and more. I learn new things about jade all the time, but honestly, so does the industry. We're still learning about jade and understanding it, and the mysteries of jade are slowly being uncovered. This is my message to the industry. Sellers, please familiarize yourself with jade and make sure your sales staff understands the difference between nephrite and Fei Cui and treated versus natural jade, and use discretion when working with a vendor or gem lab. Don't be afraid to sell jade. Be the resource that the jade shopper needs. There is plenty of demand for jade, but unfortunately, a lot of the supply is fake or treated and being lied about. If you work in the industry, be sure to check out the long version for this video, released as a podcast where you can hear the full unedited interview with Richard Hughes and Kaylan Khourie from Lotus Gemology. Thanks so much, guys.